Greetings in the name and grace and peace of Jesus, our risen Christ. I'm Nanette Roberts. I'm the senior pastor at Grace United Methodist Church, and I'm glad to be with you today, Common Grace. Kyle invited me to offer you a welcome into this service. He will be bringing us the good news and the word of proclamation, but I'm glad to be a part of the service this morning. As we gather this morning, I would remind you that this is graduation Sunday, and so we are recognizing our high school graduates and the accomplishment that they and their families are celebrating. We also are recognizing our college graduates and those who have gotten graduate degrees beyond college, whether those are master's or doctoral degrees or even postdoctoral. And so we just want all of you to know who have done such hard work that we know that you're a blessing and that God has been with you and that your families have supported you, and we want you to know that your church supports you as well. And so we celebrate with you today. I also would remind you that we are a part again of Team World Vision, trying to bring clean water to more places around the world. Part of that is preparing to walk or run in the Kansas City Marathon. And as Pastor Kyle has said, whether you have never walked any distance before or maybe you are an experienced marathon runner, it doesn't matter where you are on that journey. We invite you to participate. And if physical activity isn't a way you can participate, we invite you to participate through generosity of giving to those who are. And know that all of us together working will bring about that part of God's vision for people in the world that are in greatest need. I also would remind you that we are now offering childcare from birth through 6 years old. And so know that your children are welcome as you come to worship in person if you would like to do that at the Ball Conference Center. And we know that God is seeking to reconnect us in all that we do. As we continue in worship this morning, we know that God will lift our hearts in song. And so we invite you to join as you would wish.
To the river, come and let yourself in. Make good on a promise, never hurt again. If you're lost and lonely, you're broken down, bring all of your troubles, come lay them down. All you sinners and the weak at heart, all you helpless on the boulevards, wherever you are now, whatever you found, bring all of your troubles, come lay them down, 'cause we're all tied to same old feeling, finding shelter, things we know. We're all dirty, like corrupted small towns. Bring our troubles, bring our troubles, lay them down. High above, all those with and without love, all you burdened, broken down, all of your troubles, come lay them down, lay them down. We're all tied to same old playthings, finding shelter, things we know. We're all dirty, like corrupted small towns. Bring our troubles, bring our troubles, lay them down. same old feeling, finding shelter, things we know. We're all dirty, like corrupted small towns. Bring our troubles, bring our troubles, and lay 'em down.
Did you know everyone is part of a bigger story? It's a bigger story than you can imagine. It's a big story about a really big God. My name is Stacy, and you're looking at just a few of my Bibles. And whether you're looking up the Bible online or reading it on an app or flipping through the pages, the Bible is a library. It is 66 books of history, adventure, poetry, wisdom, letters, and even comedy. It all comes together in the incredible story of God's love for us. You see, in God's eyes, you are loved, you are unique, and you are designed for a purpose. And that should give you confidence. And that's what we're talking about all summer long. And we're defining confidence as seeing yourself the way God sees you. But before we get to our story, I have a question for you. Does anybody like to hike? Well, I am fortunate. I live in an area where there are all kinds of trails around me. I haven't even explored them all. And when I want to go hiking, I often look at an app on my phone called All Trails. And it shows me the trails to choose from. It shows me the maps and the routes and gives me different hints. And that's really good because sometimes I can be hiking in an area that's kind of complicated. You may remember a story I told last year about a time I was hiking with my dog and I got lost. You see, the route I had chosen was in an area that had lots of different stops and intersecting paths and other routes coming in and out of it. And I was on the trail, which was supposed to be just a big loop. And so I knew if I kept going the same way, I would eventually come out at the end. But then there was a sign in front of me that made no sense. It wanted me to go a direction that just could not be right. I even wondered if someone had switched the sign on purpose as a joke. So should I go that way, or should I continue on the path through the woods that eventually I knew in my mind would get me back on the trail? Well, what I couldn't see is if I continued on the way I thought was best, I would have ended up at a big ravine or a cliff. So the maps and signs are there to keep us safe and to not let us get stuck, even when you think you might know a better way. Now, sometimes we get directions or instructions that don't make sense. I mean, we think our way is better or simpler. We're even confident that our idea will work. So what do we do when a parent, a teacher, or a coach tells us to do something that doesn't make any sense? Well, if you haven't encountered that yet, you will. And so when someone you trust and has your best interest at heart says to do something that doesn't make sense to you, what do you do? Well, we're going to go back to the Old Testament to help us look at that. We're going back to the time before the Israelites were living in the land that God had promised them. You see, they had been wandering around for 40 years because they didn't trust God. And now Joshua was their leader, and he brought them up to the promised land. But it got a little complicated, starting with the big walls that were surrounding the city of Jericho. And the story ends up a little different than you might expect. They swapped their swords for trumpets, and the battle looks more like a game of Ring Around the Rosie. You can read about that in chapters 5 and 6 of Joshua. You can read about how an angel of God gave them the plan to walk around the walls and blow their trumpet, instead of what they thought they wanted to do was knock down the walls with some battering rams. So the plan was not exactly what they thought they would be doing. But they trusted God, they followed God's plans, and it happened just like God said. Now, we can't always see how things will work out in God's plan. kind of like when we see a trail sign that makes no sense, but it's there to keep us safe. That's how it was with Joshua and the Israelites. But again, they trusted God and things worked out. Think about when Jesus died on the cross, how confused the disciples were. How could that be part of God's plan? But everything made sense when Jesus rose from the dead and explained how it was to be the way it was. Sometimes you can't see exactly how things will turn out. Don't know exactly the plan God has for your family or for your life. Some things happen that are confusing and they don't make sense. But through it all, you can keep following God and living the way God wants you to live. You can trust God no matter what, and you can be confident that God has a great plan for you. I can't wait to see you next week as we continue to talk about how to see ourselves the way God sees us.
Like a fire in the night, whose flames reach and touch the sky. Burn within my soul and mind, till all I see are your eyes. Like the dawn takes back the light, like your sun brought back to life. Resurrect my soul's desire to burn again with you, love's fire. With you, love's fire. Lord God, come awaken love. Come stir my soul to long for all you are. I'm desperate just to have more of your heart. Come awaken love. Like a fire in the night, whose flames reach and touch the sky. Burn within my soul and mind, till all I see are your eyes. Like the dawn takes back the light, like your sun brought back to life. Resurrect my soul's desire to burn again with true love's fire. With true love's fire. Lord God, come awaken love. Come stir my soul to long for all you are. I'm desperate just to have your love, your heart. Come awaken love. Come awaken love. Come awaken love. Come thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. Teach me some melodious sonnet, sung by flaming tongues above. Praise the mountain fixed upon it, fount of thy redeeming love. Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I'm come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. He to rescue me from danger interposed his precious blood. Oh, to grace, how great a debtor daily I'm constrained to be. Let thy goodness, like a fetter, bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel led, prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, Lord, take and seal it for thy course above. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel led, prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, Lord, take and seal it for thy courts above.
We continue in worship now, friends, as people who are embraced by God in this time of prayer. Let us pray together. Gracious God, you have invited us into this world that in its own way is so very complex. You know that complexity more than we do, and you know the vision that you have for this world to be a place of harmony and welcome, an invitation for all people. We don't always live that out very well. We know that you invite us to see our differences as a part of a majestic quilt where all of the pieces fit together in a creation of great beauty, and when even one piece is missing, then the whole of it is not complete. But God, we admit to you that there are times when our differences get in the way, when we're not sure that those of us who are walking in the community of faith are really able to connect with those who are outside of our community. And yet that's exactly where you invite us, not in judgment or condemnation or separation, but to make connection, to listen with open hearts and authentic spirits, to learn, and to be willing to share in our vulnerability who we are and what you've done in our lives. God, we give you thanks for the opportunities we have to gain strength from the power of your word, and we ask that you would bless Pastor Kyle as he brings that word this morning. Help us to know that those words are not only meant for our ears to hear, but they are meant for our hands and our feet and our hearts to put into action. And so let us listen actively. And help us to know that as we seek to work for your will and your vision in this world, it's that vision that will lead us toward your kingdom, even as you've invited us. And it's that kingdom for which we pray in the words that Jesus has taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
Come thou fount of every blessing, to my heart to sing thy praise. Streams of mercy never ceasing, calls for songs of loudest praise. praise. Teach me some melodious sonnet, sung by flaming tongues above. Praise the mountain fixed upon it, mount of thy redeeming love.
Friends, once again, welcome to Common Grace. I'm so glad that you're taking a part of your weekend to worship with us. I'm so glad that I get to share a message with you this morning as we are in our home stretch of Romans and look to wrap that up in the next few weeks. I'm really excited about where we are and about how far we've come in this journey, and thank you for being a part of that. So we said last week, as we begin this home stretch, that we've been up to the mountaintop. We've been to the peak with Paul. He has taken us to this place in Romans 8 where he talks about this incredible grace and mercy of God that we've experienced, and that God has, about what God has already done for us. This incredible good news of that. And that Romans 8 talks about all that's happening on the cosmic level. And there's this good news for us individually in that, but we spent 2 weeks there looking around at the landscape, enjoying that amazing good news. And then we had a case study in what God's mercy looks like and God's continued plan looks like, most particularly for Paul in relationship to his Jewish brothers and sisters. And now we're coming down from the altitude. We're making our way down the mountain on the other side. And the question is so what? What do we do about all of this? What do we do in light of all of this? So Paul begins chapter 12 by saying, therefore. And in essence, what Paul is saying is, okay, these last 11 chapters, all the way from the beginning of Romans, for us all the way back in January, because of all of this good news of God's own righteousness and the faithfulness of Christ, of us being empowered by God's own Spirit, of the mercy of God at play in so many ways. Because of all of this, therefore, now live like this. Because of the mercies of God, present yourself as a living sacrifice. And so all of this, we said, as we wrap up Paul, is talking about how we live in community, how we live connected to one another, how we speak and live together, how we relate with one another. And so we've been talking about all of this. And we said from now to the end of this, basically Paul is going to talk about what it means to be a community of faith. And so last week we began with Paul's opening instructions about this, about how the community of faith connects with one another and relates to one another internally, how we act, how we talk to each other, all of that stuff. And so I asked if we could be honest about the ways that we as individuals and the places that we as a community need to find renewal this summer. And as individuals and a community and society, I asked you to think about those things, all of that. And I asked you to name the ways that you could take care of part of that for you, for your life, for your experience. And we said that this is important not just for you, but for all of us, for us as a community together, because us as individuals being transformed and strong and strengthened and renewed is what allows us to be a transforming and strong and strengthened and transforming community. That's what we said, is that all of this matters so that we can be strong together. When each of us recognizes that we belong to each other, that we belong to God, and that together we're the hands and the feet of Christ in the world, it's only then that we're able to live like we ought to as a community. And so Paul begins with these instructions internally about how we relate to one another. And friends, I almost never do this, but I want to encourage you, if you didn't catch that message, I want to encourage you to go back and listen to it. And if you have to substitute out this sermon, that's okay. And this is why I say that. It wasn't a particularly eloquent sermon. It wasn't that flashy, but it was really important. And it was a really timely message as we're still here at the beginning of summer. And so I want to ask you, if you haven't, to spend some time with that this week and wrestling with that this week, because I think that work is so important for you, for us, and for the greater community around us. So So we talked last week about all of this, and then we shared this benediction based on what Paul says genuine love is. And I just want to read these words again because they will also, just like this thread of community is running through all of this, these words about how Paul understands this genuine love in the context of Christian community will run like a thread through the rest of the book of Romans. He says this: genuine love is hating evil and clinging to what is good, being affectionate to one another in brotherly love, outdoing one another in honor, not lagging in diligence, being a fire in the Spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, and persevering in affliction, being devoted to prayer, contributing to the needs of the saints, and extending hospitality to strangers. And friends, if that could mark our lives together as a community, as far as Paul is concerned, as far as I'm concerned, we'd be well on our way to seeing what Christ envisioned for his church. So today, we continue this focus on the faithful community, except now we're going to talk about how we relate to those beyond the community. How do we relate to the broader world? So it's not just about how we order our lives together, but how do we relate to the people beyond or external to the community. And so we're going to be looking at Romans 12, beginning in verse 14, all the way through Romans 13, chapter 7 today. And in our reading, Paul will progress from calls to humility and empathy to more difficult, perhaps more pointed calls of discipleship, then to what might be considered one of the most counterintuitive maxims of the Christian faith, on to one of the most controversial and contested passages in all of Romans in the last century of our life together. Now, if that's not intriguing, friends, I don't know what is, because that's where we're going. So, hey, if you want to follow along, we'll begin reading chapter 12, verses 14 through 19. Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep, live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anybody evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is all possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. No, if your enemies... Oh, we'll stop there. Sorry. Getting ahead of myself. So at its core, most of us can look at these words and we can sort of nod our head in agreement and say, yes, those are probably good things. We can say that's probably important, and we can at least mentally ascribe to what Paul is saying. Living it, now that's a little bit more difficult. And again, it's not that we don't think it's important, it's just that it's really hard to do. But on the surface, most of us can say, you know, the world would probably be a better place if more people lived like Paul was talking about. And as I said earlier, this is essentially, when I read it, the sort of phrases that came to me were humility and empathy. This is essentially Paul calling us to live with empathy and with humility. These are virtues for us, even in our society. Now, we don't always practice them. We don't always celebrate them within the broader community. But we say, like, yes, those are good things. We can sort of accept that and celebrate that. So, how do we move from that place to practice? As a community of faith, we strive to do this. We want to live this out. Not only to say yes, but then to actually live it out and to see it happening around us. We do this in small ways and big ways. We seek to be a blessing to people. Right? We do that in as many ways as we can. We grieve with those who are grieving. We celebrate with people who are celebrating. We try to be aware and acknowledge that there's things happening around us, and we try to recognize that the experience of people around us often looks different from our own experience. And that's where the empathy piece comes in. So when our community, someone in our community is celebrating, we celebrate. But when something big is happening in the community at large, we want to celebrate that as well. And when one part of our city or our country or our world is grieving, we want to grieve with them in the midst of all of that. We want to do all of those things. That's practicing empathy. And that's part of what we do, what we try to recognize, what I try to lift up for you is that there's no single experience of the world, but instead there is this constellation, this fabric of different experiences, and we try to name that and claim that and celebrate that and do what Paul says to weep with those who weep and to celebrate with those who celebrate. It seems like I've said this a lot over the last year, but we try to remain humble. And here's what I mean by that. We can cling tightly to the things that we think are really important, the things that we believe, the things that we value, the attributes that we think are most important for a community of faith. We can hold tightly to those without having to push other people out. We can be humble about the way that we experience and understand God and the things that we hold on to, and recognize that other people have different experiences. And how do we balance those things of holding on to that, but also practicing humility, living in that place? How do we hold firmly, but also remain cloaked in compassion and graciousness with other folks? How do we seek not only... I want to go one step further. How do we also embrace people who may have different experiences than we do? Are we humble enough to do that? And friends, I hope that we are. I push us towards that as a community. Paul is asking us to live peaceably with all, to live in harmony with one another. And I think most of the time, most of our people and most of the people around us, we want to do that. We want to live in that way. And yet, sometimes we do that just by avoidance. Like, if we cloister over here, then we'll live peaceably because we're just sort of separated from the people that we disagree with. When Paul talks about a radical faith community, he's not talking about a group that cloisters. He will ask them to be careful, and we'll read this later about how they relate to the outside world. In language that I don't especially love, he'll invite them to pick and choose their battles. But it's not by withdrawing. It's not by making themselves small. It's not by separating. So how do we not just live peaceably by keeping ourselves separate from those with whom we would have conflict, but how do we live peaceably, actively? How do we live graciously and compassionately and open and embrace? That's part of the question. Not a peaceful avoidance, but a peaceful or a harmonious engagement. And so all of this up to this point begins to, all of it sort of makes sense for us so far. This last piece, verse 19, these acts of vengeance, don't take acts of vengeance. I want to be clear about what Paul means there. In essence, what he's talking about is sort of vigilante justice. And we're going to see this come up in chapter 13 when we get there in just a couple of minutes. But what he's saying is don't take it upon yourself to bring about justice. And there's some interesting pieces about that. Number one, and this is pointed out by N.T. Wright, he begins that sentence with beloved. And it's pretty unusual for Paul to just bury that language of beloved. That's used a lot. But for Paul to bury that kind of in the middle of a thought is unusual. And it's almost as if there's this dance where he's saying, hey, you don't have to get even. You don't have to level the playing field or make things right or get back at that person. Remember, you're a beloved child of God. And can that be enough for us? Can we sort of swallow it rather than engaging in hostility with other folks, even if we've had wrong done to us? There's this reminder of beloved, like, hey, remember who you are. Yeah, I know that thing happened, but remember, don't do vigilante justice. And remember, if God is in charge, if God's sort of directing this whole thing, and not to say that every single action is directed, but if the end is in mind, if we have a picture of where things are going and we believe that God is working towards that end, Paul's saying, beloved, keep that in mind. And so I love that idea and that reminder for us. And I love that this is going to help lead us to chapter 13 here in just a second. So I want to say that all of this, perhaps we can be in general agreement with everything that Paul has said up to this point. We can sort of nod our heads and say, yes, we're in for that. Even if we struggle a little bit with what it looks like to live that out in our day-to-day life. But I want to ask you to keep the frame of community in mind as we go through this. And so I want to ask you, what do you think this looks like for us as a community of faith? For us as a community that gathers in this digital place, for us as a community that also gathers in person, for us who seem to be gathered in one geographical area for the most part, but also spread out. What does it look like for us as a community to do all these things that Paul has called us to do? How do we embody that? And truth be told, I don't have a lot of answers, but I want to invite you to wrestle with those questions. I want to invite you to think about those things. I want us together to think about those things so that we can understand how to do this, how to faithfully live into this vision that Paul has and I think Christ has for his church. How do we do that? How do we live like that? What does that look like for us to enact that, not only individually, but within our community as well? So like I said, hold on to that. Let's keep wrestling with that together. And we're not going to come up with a lot of answers at the end of this. I would love to have dialogue about that. I want to hear input on all of that. But we've said up to this point, all of this is sort of virtuous. It's generally agreeable. We don't always do it, but we can nod our heads and say, yes, the world would probably be a better place if we did that. But then Paul's going to get to a little bit more pointed call of discipleship in verse 20. No, he says, if your enemies are hungry, feed them, and if they're thirsty, give them something to drink, for by doing this you'll heap burning coals upon their heads. We're going to leave that last part for another time. I'd love to chat with you about what he's talking about there. But this feels like discipleship that perhaps we are familiar with. Jesus talks about this, blessing those who persecute us. We're maybe familiar with it, but it's a bit unsettling. It's certainly not comfortable. Part of why it's not comfortable is because, first of all, we would have to acknowledge that we have enemies, and most of us like to think that we don't. And maybe we don't have enemies as people that we're actively seeking to do harm with, but perhaps we could think about the lines and the divisions that we create in our own minds. Well, we do that a lot. Maybe it's geopolitical. Over the last couple of months, we've heard a lot about Palestine and Israel, and perhaps you have an affinity for one side or the other's particular perspective in the conflict, and so you identify as more pro-Palestinian or more pro-Israeli. And maybe it's easy to draw a line in the sand and to say those who are on the other side must be the enemy. Maybe it happens a little bit more close to home in the geopolitical realm. Maybe it's just the political realm. Maybe we think about the Capitol rioters of January 6th, and maybe you think those people are the enemies. Or perhaps you think that the people who think those people are the enemies are the enemies. Maybe we're divided in that sort of way by where our affinity or understanding or our perspective falls. Maybe we draw lines in the sand over Black Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter, and we don't have interest in talking across those lines, or we're real quick to vilify people who live on the other side or identify on the other side. Or perhaps, especially in this Pride Month, we draw a line in the sand about how inclusive somebody is, about the LGBTQIA community, or how exclusive they are. And we say we're not interested in bridging that gap. These are all ways that we can sort of draw lines in the sand. Maybe it's far more personal. Maybe there's one family member who is especially draining for you. Maybe there's a neighbor that you actively seek to avoid. There's all kinds of ways that we do this. Part of why Paul's command feels uncomfortable is because if we take it seriously, we have to ask those questions about who are the people that we think of as somehow less than, or perhaps the people that we don't bother to think of at all. And maybe that gets to the heart of the people who are our enemies. Who are the people that are trying to bring harm or trying to tear apart something that we love as we understand it and that we sort of push away. So that's difficult. That's a hard piece to acknowledge that we even have enemies. And then to bridge the gap, to provide food and water, to provide sustenance, to believe that it still matters to provide for another's very most basic needs. But that leads us to what is one of the central ethics of the Christian faith, and one of these maxims that perhaps defines who we are most especially. And this is verse 21. Do not overcome evil, but overcome evil. Do not overcome evil by evil, but overcome evil with good. I'm challenged by that. Remember a few weeks ago, and I already alluded to this, we said in chapter 8 that Paul has begun with the end in mind. He has this picture of where all of this is going, of what God is going to do, of the God who can make good and beautiful things come out of even the broken places. Paul has this vision in mind, and he begins with that. Every step he takes, his whole perspective on the world, ever since his conversion, has been turned upside down, and he almost views the world backwards. He looks from the place of redemption, from the consummation of the ages, from the making of all things, the making of all things right. He looks at the world backwards through that. And he can see that. And we said one of the central examples that we have of that is how life comes out of death in the experience of Jesus. And in the death, there is the resurrection. And in the face of violence, Jesus does not respond in kind with violence. Instead, he responds. Well, it's almost as if he doesn't respond. But rather than bringing about bigger or badder violence, his good is silence. And out of that good comes the possibility of new life for all of us. Do not overcome evil with evil, but overcome evil with good. This is a central part of who we are as a Christian people, and Paul will remind us of that is a critical part of our discipleship. And so we see these examples all through the Christian faith, and we've been talking about them over the last month, but that's what Paul is calling us to do as a community of faith. So I want to share just a couple of thoughts on the ground that we've covered. Number one, N.T. Wright talks about this idea of saying if we become consumed by vengeful thoughts or led to act on our vengeful thoughts, what we're doing is perpetuating this cycle of evil. And I think that's a really challenging word because we think that we don't want to participate in that, and we think we would resist that, and yet we also know what it is to want to lash out at somebody who has lashed out at us. But he uses particularly the phrase evil in circulation. And I think back to what Paul said last week about how it requires intentionality, not conformity, but to be transformed. To break this cycle of evil, to stop the momentum, it takes patience and it takes intention. And in essence, what Paul is calling us to do is to live with patience and intention to stop the cycles of violence. And in fact, that we can turn them and use the power, rather than power for perpetuating evil, instead to use that power to turn it into goodness. Break that circulation. A second thought. One commentator has called this a disposition of generosity. To begin from a place of graciousness. To start in that place rather than a beginning in a place of skepticism or distrust. To begin from a place of generosity. And it doesn't mean, by the way, that we just do that blindly. It's the starting point. It's where we begin. And if we look at the world generously, not only those within our community, but those beyond our community, what possibility does that create for us? Finally, a third point that I want us to remember without repeating all of last week's sermon. Remember that all of this continues from what Paul started last week, of this presentation of our bodies as a living sacrifice transformed by Christ. That this was our logical worship. What we're talking about today is all an extension of our logical worship, our logical response to God's mercies and grace. This is how we are to live in light of all of the mercy of God. So all of this is the natural response, Paul will say, to how we live. Now, if you're going to follow along and read through verse 7 of chapter 3, I'm not going to go into all of it for a lack of time, But I would invite you to keep these ideas in mind. And this is one of the most controversial passages in all of Romans, because Paul begins by saying this: let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. And so we look at the landscape, even of the last century, of the rise of totalitarian governments and the ways that that has robbed our world of human life and of dignity and of well-being. And a lot of people have pushed back and said, wait a minute, what does Paul mean by all of that? And it's a fair question. It's also a question that I think is rooted in trying to pull Paul out of his context and put him into our context. I don't think he's giving us a systematic theology, much as we might like him to, of how the church and the state coexist together, or what the government is. This passage does require a lot of care, and we could spend a long time on it, but I want to just zoom in on the last part of it, again, mostly for the sake of time. He says this in verse 7, pay to all what is due to them, taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, and honor to whom honor is due. And I wonder if we can just hold on to that idea and to think about these principles that we've talked about, that our life as a community, as our logical worship, that defines how we relate to other people, that we could begin with a disposition of generosity to everybody in the world, even those who might want to persecute us or harm us, that we could do that, keeping in mind that maxim of the Christian faith, and that we might see ourselves as breakers of the cycle, as interrupters, as those who use a little bit of patience, a great amount of intention, and a whole lot of prayer for grace to change the circulation of evil that sometimes exists in our world. And so, friends, that's what I want us to think about. We could unpack this so much more, but as we think about how we relate to these governing authorities, that's what chapter 7, the beginning part of it, chapter 13, the beginning part of it addresses. I think if we keep some of those things in mind and understand that what Paul is trying to help us understand is how we relate to other people in a way that's faithful to the example of Christ, it will be challenging. The call of discipleship will always be challenging. And it doesn't mean that we sit back and let anything happen, but there is this belief that Paul has that somehow having some governance is usually, not always, but usually better than anarchy. And that perhaps the specific office, perhaps the specific person is not divinely placed there by God, but that idea of having some sort of structure and form to society is better than anarchy in whatever form most of the time that it would present itself. And so, friends, I want to just end with this little bit. As we offer our logical response as individuals and as a community, and we think about how as a community we relate to the world, I hope that our community at Common Grace will be defined by blessings for the world, by rejoicing with those who rejoice, by mourning with those who mourn. I hope we'll be marked by humility and empathy, and that we'll live in harmony, as Christ said, to actively seek peace, to engage it. Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. We want to live peaceably with all so far as we're able. I hope that we can trust in God's ability to address what is wrong and to work with God in the right making that's never retributive, but always looking towards moving the world forward. And I hope that with our work, we can help in some small way overcome evil, not with evil, but with good in all things. I hope that within and beyond the community, we may give to each person what is due, to give honor to those whom honor is due, and to give worship to whom worship is due. Notice Paul leaves that out of the governance piece, because worship, our logical response to what God has done, is always due to God. So, friend, what would it look like to be a part of that? What would it look like for you to be a part of that? What would it look like for our community to live that? That's what I want us to wrestle with this week. I don't have all of the answers, but I think together we can get there, and we can begin to think about how we make this known, how we as a community live differently because of what God has done. Let's take a few moments to reflect on that this morning.
The power of God's good news is that even though we don't always see it, God has blessed us with a world of abundance and not scarcity. And so given the resources that God has given us to be good stewards over, to figure out how best to use our resources, we invite you into a time of offering. We are so grateful for how you continue to support the ministries of the church and the ministries of our mission as we seek to reach around the world. And so you will see on your screen different ways to offer what you have to God, and know that those gifts are blessed as well as your hands that bring them. And those gifts are also blessed in the hands that receive them, so that each of us as givers and receivers understand ourselves to be part of God's beloved family here and around the world. I'll also invite you just now to join us for our closing hymn.
Heavenly Father, you always amaze me. Let your kingdom come in my world, in my life. Give me the food I need to live through the day. Forgive me as I forgive the people that wrong me. Lead me far from temptation. Deliver me from the evil one. I look out the window, the birds are composing. Not a note is out of tune or out of place. I walk to the meadow, stare at the flowers. Better dressed than any girl on her wedding day. So why should I worry? Why do I freak out? God knows what I need. You know what I need. Your love is, your love is, your love is strong. Your love is, your love is, your love is strong. Your love is, your love is, your love is strong. The kingdom of the heavens is now advancing. Invade my heart, invade this broken town. The kingdom of the heavens is buried treasure. Would you sell yourself to buy the one you found? Two things you told me is that you are strong and you love me. Yes, you love me. Your love is, your love is, your love is strong. strong. Your love is strong. The kingdom of the heavens is buried treasure. Would you sell yourself to buy the one you found?
Amen. Hear this blessing as we prepare to go out into God's world. May God, who began this good work in us, carry it through to completion, enabling us to use our talents to the fullest. May God give us the grace to make wise choices and to be faithful to our commitments, always confident in the support of those who love us. May God bless us with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships so that we will live deep within our hearts. May God bless us with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people so that we will work for justice, equality, and peace. And may God bless us with tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, starvation, and war so that we will reach out our hands to comfort them and change their pain into joy. May God bless us with foolishness to think that we can make a difference in the world so that we will do the things which others tell us cannot be done. May our integrity and our faithfulness be a gift to the world, and may the Spirit of God be with us always. Amen.